This is one of the coolest experiences for me as an author, just being able to interact with people and just get feedback. So I'm really here to learn more than anything. So I hope to come away from this having learned things about mimesis that I certainly didn't know. So, this is certainly not a talk that I'm giving or anything. I want this to be as interactive as possible. I do tons of podcasts, and frankly, I'm like sort of sick of them. And this format I'm really excited about because we can all just talk and share. So I don't even want me to be the one answering questions. I would like it to just be a discussion. I really wanted to just light up a pipe and be in a cozy room with wood panels and a fireplace, just chatting with you all. But I got kicked out of my home office by my wife, Claire, because she had important sales calls to take, and I let her use my office. So I'm here at my office in the university that I teach at. So that's my setting, my little standing desk here. So that's what I hope to get out of it. The more important question is if there's anything that you all would like to get out of it. No, I wish they let me. What you all hope to get out of it, so that I can try to deliver that experience. So if you'd like to share that or put it in the chat, please do let me know.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's not too many of us here today. We could do a round of introductions of what people want to get out of the session, or we can kick off with a couple of questions. What would you prefer? Are you ready to be put on the spot, people of the salon? Should I pick on you, or should we move on? Maybe we should open up with a couple of questions then for Luke, while everyone is sort of getting used to the whole format here. Maybe we can just do a quick raise of hands as to anyone who has not been at a salon before. If you want to put your hand up, if it's your first time, if you are a intellect virgin, or we've got one over there. Let's just have a quick introduction then there. For people that haven't attended these salons before, there's nothing quite like it on the internet. There's lots of things that are similar, but not exactly the same. This is quite a safe space to talk about things that you perhaps wouldn't be able to do in your day-to-day life, and certainly wouldn't get to with the normal Zoom calls that we've been doing in our lockdown world. But the point is to really try and interrogate ideas and to play with those ideas in a safe space with people that are also interested in exploring that. And I think that a lot of us are interested in this idea of mimesis because it does cut into so many different areas of our lives. It's something that we can all relate to no matter where in the world that we are. So I suppose my first question for Luke would be, when you wrote your book, what was the one thing you were hoping people would take away from it at the end? Why did you actually write this thing?
It's a great question. Before I answer it, can I just see either a show of hands or in the chat? Has anybody in the salon read the book Wanting? Just so I sort of know. Okay. About a third or so. That's good to know. I plan to make this discussion completely unreliant in anything that's in the book at all. But as you all know, this is an incredibly complex topic with different bits and pieces. There's so many different things to talk about. 2 hours is like the blink of an eye. The one thing that I think I wanted people to take away from the book was the importance of understanding mimetic desire kind of in the cultural moment that we're in, as I see a lot of rivalries, a lot of scapegoating. And it's something that you just sort of never hear about, these kind of hidden forces in the media or in sort of explanations about why things happen. It's just completely swept under the rug. And that's sort of like by design, right? Girard would say, like, this is a hidden force that is like, unintentionally sort of suppressed. And that's why his magnum opus is Things Hidden from the Foundation of the World. So I sort of realized that there was Girard had sort of been trapped in academia. And there are great conferences, scholars get together every year. But I think I realized that we just need to be having discussions about mimesis, and it will help us interpret the signs of the times and the events that are happening in the world. And I just didn't think that it was given enough attention. I mean, the idea of scapegoating is not one that you often hear in the media, for instance. So it's an interpretive key that I just wanted to stimulate more discussion around. Girard said at the end of one of his books, he goes, at the end of the day, books will be of minor importance as to how everything sort of plays out in the world. And he got very apocalyptic at the end of his life. He was very dark. And he sort of had an idea of humanity. The apocalypse in Girard's mind was humanity destroying itself, not God destroying the world. And he got very dark and apocalyptic. And he said, books will be of minor importance, but it's the events that happen, the events that unfold will be of critical importance for sort of understanding where things are at. And mimetic theory, I think, provides an interpretive key for those events. So rather than there being one particular, point or message from the book, I just wanted to try to present an introduction to the whole body of knowledge, to Girard himself and to the work, and to the work, so that people could apply this in their own ways to just do some sense making around some of the craziness that we're seeing, whether it's things related to the pandemic, the way that things are playing out with that. I mean, I finished this book shortly after the pandemic started. Had I known when I started that we would be living in a world like this, I would have had even more of a sense of urgency. So that's only accelerated, I think, with the pandemic. So it was the short answer to the question is to give an interpretive key so that we could have discussions like this where people can bring different perspectives to the table and interpret those events. And I'm very mindful that the book is written from a certain perspective. It's written from my perspective as an entrepreneur. I have a Western American perspective. A lot of the examples I use in the book are from business, from the startup world, because that's what I know the best. And we're just not only scratched at the surface yet of like how people in different cultures with different experiences may be able to relate to mimetic desire in different parts of the world, people with different upbringings. And I'm just fascinated to start having those conversations.
That's really
Maybe
fascinating.
we can go for it.
Yeah, no. One thing that you kept bringing up was the theme of scapegoats. And yesterday, you, I think, posted about how if you live by mimesis, you die by mimesis. And you brought up the case of Elizabeth Holmes and how scapegoating is evolving and becoming increasingly complex. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that? Or is that something your thoughts are still evolving around?
We can jump right into that. I mean, just to give a little bit of context, I wrote an article about Elizabeth Holmes that I posted on my Substack yesterday, and then it was republished on Medium's publication Marker. And I'm already getting a ton of hate mail for it. It's definitely the most controversial thing that I've written yet. I talk about Elizabeth Holmes in the book, and I mentioned that one does not need to be innocent in order to be a scapegoat. And this is completely in line with Girard. There's a psychological and a sociological process that's going on that is, the process is independent of the guilt or innocence of the person, of the victim. And that's a very common sort of misconception about how the scapegoat mechanism works and what scapegoating is. So I had somebody reach out to me who lives in Washington, D.C., who was one of John Kiriou's from the Wall Street Journal's key sources when he wrote the book Bad Blood, exposing the Theranos scandal, the fraud, and the Elizabeth Holmes story. His name is John Fwiss. And John reached out to me after he read Wanting. And he just said, Luke, listen, I've been sued viciously by Elizabeth Holmes 2 times. And I just have a different perspective on some of the things that are going on in this case. And I don't think that John Kiriou of the Wall Street Journal really covered them. I think he was trying to shape a very specific narrative. And then a lot of the other journalists are just writing into that narrative. And would you be willing to meet up and have a chat? So we did. He shared some things he'd never told anybody else before. And I'm not a journalist, by the way. So I was kind of like, in over my head. I don't even know how these things work. I don't even know the lingo. Are we on background here? Are we not? Can I record this? So we had this meeting, it was like something out of a movie. We were like under this overpass in Georgetown. It was rain pouring down on both sides of us, having beers. I thought I should show up in a trench coat or something. And you know, his perspective was that, you know, despite being in this position, despite having had a horrible experience with Elizabeth Holmes, and despite thinking and knowing that she, you know, is guilty in his opinion, that it doesn't mean that she's not being used in some way by our society as some kind of a scapegoat. Whether that's to, you know, keep us from looking at other things going on, at other people, at other processes, at other systemic problems going on. He said, I think that whatever happens in this case, and he said, you know, I think she's probably going to get 14 months of jail time or something like that. Was his, he's a patent attorney. And he said, but that's besides the point. You know, I think that there's a side to the story that nobody's telling, and it's kind of how this happened in the first place. Like, how did we even get here? How is an Elizabeth Holmes possible? And I think a lot of people are sort of scapegoating business, or scapegoating, you know, the way that startups work. I think that's not helpful, really. I mean, just the story in some sense is being painted as like, whatever, the evils of capitalism or the evils of Silicon Valley fundraising or something like that. That's a whole different side of the story. But I mean, let's just think about, you know, how was Elizabeth Holmes able to raise $700 million in the first place from investors? That was a mimetic process. There was a ton of mimetic desire going on there that converged around one person that had a certain kind of mystique. If you listen to some of the testimony, even in court today, one of the young scientists said that she was, quote, starstruck when she first met Elizabeth Holmes. And so were a lot of these very prominent people. They were just, for whatever reason, she like mesmerized them and had some kind of power over them. That's something that I talk about a little bit in the book, the distortion of reality, like how Steve Jobs had this reality distortion field. People can create this kind of reality distorting mystique around themselves if they behave in certain ways. And we can talk a little bit about that. I think if we start talking about celebrity and social media and representation and the games that people play with desire. But Elizabeth Holmes certainly harnessed the power of it, harnessed the power of mimesis, and you know, from her perspective, in a positive way, to raise a lot of money to fund her company. And I'll tell you, I guarantee you that the second 10 million was a lot easier to raise than the first 10 million. And the third 10 million was a lot easier to raise than the second, because people weren't doing their due diligence. You know, they would just look at the other people that had funded her. They would, or come before them, what they were saying about her and their prestige in the community. And then they would just follow along. And the scary thing is, or the interesting thing is it works kind of the same way in the downside, right? Like everything sort of converges around a single fixed, you know, focal point. So there's a convergence on the way up and there's a convergence on the way down, you know, when things go wrong. And the bubble popped, right? The illusion popped due to good investigative journalism. So I want to be clear. I think I think what Carey did is a great thing. He certainly helped uncover the fraud, but I think that the dynamics of what's going on with scapegoating are just not very well understood. And I think that if you can, when we have these discussions about scapegoating, they're often very abstract. And Elizabeth Holmes is one of the few cases that I see right now where you have everything all kind of in the same case. You have the mimetic desire being generated to, you know, to sort of drive up the valuation of this company. You know, it's, and practically like the NFT market right now. And then, you know, you have a mimetic crisis, you have distorted reality, and then you have, I think, the scapegoat mechanism on the other side. So you have so many different things going on, all embodied in one case. And I think that if we can understand what's going on in that case, we might be able to understand some of what's going on with cancel culture, and some of the tactics that people use to, you know, to raise tons of money and defraud people in the markets. So there's so many different things to sort of take away from this case. And you know, I think there's some people get the article, especially the people that have read the book. I mean, it's hard to try to explain the scapegoat mechanism in 2,000 to 3,000 words. It's extremely hard. It's hard to do in an entire book. It's really hard to do in a single piece. I tried my best, and some people got it. But I think, like, if the initial reaction is like, well, she's guilty, like, how dare you, sort of, present any kind of alternative narrative? That's actually the point of the article. I'm just trying to say, like, what makes us so uncomfortable about the social processes that go into this vitriolic sort of, hatred of an individual. I hope that justice is served no matter what happens. But I'm just trying to turn the mirror back on us and our humanity and what goes on in our society, because it's going to continue. The mimetic stuff is like that we're seeing with the pandemic, especially in the United States, sort of turning into a mimetic crisis. So sometimes I think if we can see what's going on in one case, hopefully we can sort of translate that and begin to see it in other places as well. That was a long-winded answer. Sorry.
I want to sort of jump in there a little bit, because in terms of what you were saying about the Elizabeth Holmes case and the whole fact that, she might go to jail or not, I think it's also a point to be made there that, I mean, like, I've definitely had conversations with lawyer friends and family members who say that so much of our legal system set up in the sort of democratic West, for those of us who are sort of privileged enough to live in those spaces, is set up not actually to do with punishing the guilty or even sort of reforming the guilty, so much it is about appeasing the population, which gets one thinking that much of our legal system is actually set up around the scapegoat mechanism. Although we think it's about justice, it's actually about making the population happy. And I do speak to that differently. I live in South Africa, so we come from a slightly different perspective. But there's been quite a big sense in our society that why the South African sort of apartheid wounds haven't healed as much as they could have is because there has been no scapegoat. So there's been no catharsis. And we're starting to see that now. 30 years after the end of apartheid, we're starting to pick out scapegoats of people that committed crimes in the 80s and 90s, and making just a couple of examples, sending just a couple of people to jail, even though they are now old and no longer a threat to society, and the punishment, whatever there is within their own soul, has already either taken place or not, and there's definitely no chance for sort of rehabilitation at this point in time. But that's simple act of simply sending one or two out of hundreds of thousands of perpetrators to jail in a very public court case changes the whole social discourse. And it also opens up the ability for us to now prosecute new generation free South Africa criminals, because we have had criminal politicians that have been voted into public office based on a very democratic process, but we were not able to punish them until we had started to make points out of the perpetrators of the past crimes. Society can't move forward. There's no legitimacy in a legal system that has not got some sort of a scapegoat to point back on. I don't know how you feel about that, or if you would agree that a lot of our legal system, a lot of the reasons why so many sort of sentences that are passed down feel unfair for the people involved in the cases are because it's not actually about them. It's not actually about the victims' families or the victim themselves. It's about society at large. It's about setting the example, putting up a case of sort of fear against not doing things you don't end up the same way, and also a case of just showing that this can work. And I don't know if you agree with that, but I certainly see that in my legal system. Maybe you live in different societies where the law is more fair and ordered, but I would definitely say that it does still play through even in our very secular, very rational societies.
I'd love to, I'll just make one comment on that, and then I'd love to hear from anybody else, if anybody would like to weigh in.
Just put your hand up if you want to say something. There's the little, should have a hand button.
So, there are, the media and the narrative plays a very important role in this. If everything just happened behind closed doors, it may not have the effect on society. So I think that you're right. In a sense, you could make the case that we need scapegoats. I think, Girard would say that that's always been the case. And you would have some very smart Girard scholars who would go so far as to say that if you got rid of something like capital punishment in the United States, that like the entire society might just implode or something like that. Okay, so this is not me endorsing anything. This is just that's just the perspective of some Girardians who say that it is actually needed. It's such a deeply embedded part of human nature that basically, to your point, Bronwyn, that it does, making examples out of people, allowing somebody to be visibly punished, and then making sure that that narrative does what it's supposed to do in society is an important part of the process. Yet we couch all of these things in just hyper sort of rationalist terms. We talk about justice and we speak about them in legal terms. We don't often acknowledge the psychological factors that are involved, the psychological need almost. And again, I'm not saying that it's a good thing and that we should go around punishing scapegoats. But some would say that, what else do we do then if we were to get rid of this particular system that we have?
And Peter, I think you have your hand raised.
I do. It's sort of I was going to broaden it to sort of politics. So if you want to linger on scapegoats for a bit, maybe there's someone else who wants to dive in.
Kiki, did you have a comment or question?
Yeah, I was going to touch on that a little bit, like sort of trying to understand how scapegoating could work in today's contemporary society. I do understand like the need for it. Like there is this psychological need that ancient tribes and prehistoric tribes did partake in that act in order to sort of like restore peace. And I guess it's this idea that it's this public knowledge that the scapegoat mechanism is happening, because that's what makes people, I guess, so I think one thing Gerard mentioned was this idea of vengeance, and people would be trying to get back at each other if like some sort of violence did happen. And by the law being in place, you just stop that vengeance because you don't act in vengeance against the law. Like it's this one thing that creates the scapegoat, and then now justice is served and like the violence doesn't like spiral out of control. But one thing I wonder is like, because we live in such a digital society, like for us as viewers of this phenomena, like maybe it's more important that the idea of the person is being scapegoated. They don't necessarily have to be scapegoated themselves, but like the spectacle of them that like the media is producing is what's maybe more important. So maybe that's a way to like detach like the tribal and like the violent parts of scapegoating with like our psychological needs for it. Because like if you see someone being scapegoated in like a TV show or a movie, almost maybe it's like there is like justice being served, but maybe it doesn't have to be as like I don't know, like as bad as it needs to be.
Thank you. That's a great point. And you use the phrase, I think, awareness of the scapegoat or like what's happening. One thing I would say about that, and this goes back to the very first question, I think, around, how do I think that the scapegoat mechanism is changing in 2021? And Gerard said that the scapegoat mechanism only works if people aren't aware that they're involved in it. It simply does not work if the awareness is there. So you could almost think of it as like a pill or something that has lost its efficacy. It just doesn't work anymore, or like, I need to drink like more and more coffee to get the same fix. Like it's not working the way that it. So the more that there is awareness of the scapegoat mechanism, the less effective the old forms of it were, and the more we need to sort of invent other forms of scapegoating that people are not aware of, or most people are not aware of. And I think that's happening in the digital world. Anybody that I've ever known that has sort of, been involved in publicly humiliating an individual, ruining somebody's career, canceling somebody or something like that. I've never had a single one of them, say, we're going to go and create a scapegoat right now so that we can, bring some peace to our little corner of the metaverse. Nobody says that, right? It's just like everybody in their minds is just doing something that's totally just.
So Rick, you raised your hand, and then Peter, I think you had a question as well. So we'll start with Rick and then go to Peter.
Yeah, I think I'm intrigued at the idea of Elizabeth Holmes as a Girardian scapegoat. I think it's quite apt, actually, in that, remember, Girard says, as I understand him, that the function of a scapegoat is to restore peace to the community. That what happens is you have mimetic disorder that eventually breaks out in some sort of dysfunction or violence, and the community says, oh, it wasn't us, it was them. And I think if you look at Elizabeth Holmes, I think she's a classic Girardian scapegoat, because you have, especially in the Silicon Valley culture, you have a culture which is predicated where billions of dollars is floating around on technologies that are largely unproven. And there's a lot of mimetic work going on. And as far as I can understand it from Elizabeth Holmes' case, is she just decided to take a technology that wouldn't work and keep pushing it as far as she could go. And I think it's apt, that what's happened is the tech community can now turn and say, oh, it was her, it wasn't us. And or in fact, the culture as a whole can say it was this one person who was acting out of bounds. And the function of it is that it restores order and peace to the community.
Yeah, thanks for that, Rick. Thanks. I do think she's classic, a classic scapegoat. Also, two points. One is she was a total outlier. She had all of those distinguishing traits of your classic scapegoat, right? Like way on the outside of sort of the normal distribution, in terms of her quirks, and like when I was reading the narrative and watched the documentary, it's like she doesn't blink. Like these crazy, of course she blinks, right? You're just hearing like these outlandish kind of like stories about her. And that's exactly what you see in some of these, ancient narratives too. And then it was also the kind of like sort of unanimous nature of the accusations, and it was the level of confidence and obviousness without from what I could see, like a single dissenting voice, that also made me think, maybe there's something else going on here. And I turned to my wife and I was like, I'm thinking about just kind of like using the Elizabeth Holmes case as an example of, to make the point that to serve some function. If you think of scapegoating almost as a social technology, that Elizabeth Holmes might be serving some kind of a social function, regardless of her guilt or innocence. And Claire was like, you better be careful. Like, anybody, like any kind of sympathetic statement is not going to be met well. And I was like, but I think it's important to say. So yes, I agree. I think she's got all of the characteristics. And if we're able to separate the process from the outcome, I think it becomes pretty clear.
Peter, did you want to chime in?
Sure. I guess I still have a question to just check whether I've understood the role of scapegoating theory in Girard properly. So as I read it, the scapegoating thing is kind of like a sub part of the sort of broader story about the mimetic desire. So it would be like pretty fine to accept that broad story about how desire works, and then reject the sub-theory of the scapegoat mechanism. So my first question is just like, is that the right way to understand the relationship between these two things? Or are they actually kind of more tightly bound up than that for Girard? And then the second question that sort of relates to that is just how strong is the empirical case for scapegoating theory? Because I don't know, one sort of has to, sadly, I think, sort of start engaging with social science with just like extremely skeptical priors, right? And so personally, for what it's worth, I'm kind of like, yeah, sort of like somewhat buying the mimetic theory of desire thing, but then the scapegoating thing smells a bit like, I don't know, I'm not very sort of persuaded about that. So I'm sort of curious how you think those two relate. And how
I love
strong the
that.
case is.
I love the question because I agonized over that question for the last 3 years and went into the way that I approach my book, frankly.
Oh, cool.
So I think I'm in the minority here, but I do think that they can be detached in the sense that I don't think it's all or nothing. I don't think you have to buy everything that Girard is saying in order to see that there's truths in certain places. One of the criticisms of it, and I have it myself, is that it's a sort of a theory of everything. It's a very universalizing theory, and it tries to do a lot. It may try to do too much. And many people, I think, start with the scapegoat mechanism. They go straight to theology. They start, talking about the crucifixion of Christ. That's a lot. That's and actually the scapegoat mechanism is really like one of the final steps in mimetic theory if you view it as unfolding through a series of processes. So one of them is desire is mimetic. Mimetic desire is the nature of desire. Step 2, well, this leads to conflict, this leads to rivalries. Step 3, that can spread through contagion and can lead to sort of crises in communities and societies. How are those crises resolved? The resolution, scapegoat mechanism. And then there's even a step after that. And then I call that the cover up. And then what happens? And then there are narratives and mythologies that cover that up. Okay. So that's a lot of stuff to talk about. Like sometimes, I've been on podcasts where people like explain mimetic theory to me and they want a 5-minute answer. It doesn't work like that, So I think they can be detached. I think they can be and should be discussed as independent things. I don't think that you need to sort of to buy into everything. I personally think that the scapegoat mechanism, the origins of culture, all of the anthropology in Girard is the hardest part to accept, because in sort of a Popperian sense, it's non-falsifiable. It's really like non-falsifiable. You can't verify it, you can't falsify it, and that can be problematic. It's like, well, whatever you say, Girard has an answer, right? And I think a lot of people sort of crave some more sort of empirical evidence that these things are true. Now, Girard would say that even if you're reading some narrative about some peaceful society that existed, you're just reading a cover up. You're just reading a glossed over sort of whitewashed narrative. And he would say the best evidence that there's been a crime is if there have been if there's a bunch of cleaning chemicals and stuff like that at the scene and there's not a single trace that anybody did anything wrong. You can almost be sure that there was a crime. So he reads backwards, but you have to accept a lot of premises to get to that point. And I think that I actually share your skepticism, and it's why I made a very intentional decision when I wrote Wanting to approach it differently. And I was like, I'm just going to focus a lot on mimesis and mimetic desire. And I'm going to spend like the first 40,000 words of this book trying to just talk about that. If you want to go to the scapegoat mechanism and you want to talk about the role of religion, we could do that. And I'm not going to pretend that it's not part of mimetic theory, but I think that it's probably not the best place to start, because we can do a phenomenology of desire. And I sort of call Girard a phenomenologist in some ways, right? We're looking at the phenomenon of human desire. And I think he saw a part, like an aspect of that phenomenon that nobody had seen before, that the nature of human imitation goes beneath just representation, the imitation of external things like accents and fashion and things like that. down to the level of desire. And that is such an interesting insight. You know, mimetic desire is his big idea. Girard is a hedgehog. He had one big idea, and the big idea is mimetic desire. And then he showed how that plays out in cultures, but that's his big idea. And, you know, people could write 100 books just on that, on mimetic desire, and the way that that plays out in politics, in cultures, and in our lives. I held something similar to a salon with my premium Substack readers. So we got on a Zoom call last month, and I had no agenda. And I was just opening it up, and we ended up just talking about like career and vocation and sort of you know, how one deals with mimetic desire in their personal relationships and in their work life, and whether or not, you know, how do I know whether I should change jobs or not, things like that. Spent the whole time talking about that, right? So I think it's most powerful when you know, you have some kind of experiential sort of touch point with it, and that it's not just, you know, we're talking about, you know, sacrificial rituals in ancient cultures. It can be hard to relate to.
Speaking of mimetic desire and personal relationships, one thing that I was trying to figure out when reading the book is you mentioned that sometimes we have mirror mimetic cycles where we act in opposition to what we're seeing around us. And I was wondering, well, when are we more susceptible to that versus when are we more likely to follow the people who are around us and share traits we might find desirable? And I couldn't really find a pattern. Like, is it certain types of relationships that are susceptible, certain types of people? And is there room for external influence?
That stage that you're describing, where there's kind of, you know, mirrored or reflexive imitation. You know, you wear black tees, I wear white tees. This is a great story that Gucci Mane tells in his biography, by the way. There was a rival rap group, I think on the other side of Atlanta, that put out a song called White Tee. And it was a very popular song, blew up, and Gucci Mane, you know, desired their success and was sort of viewed them as rivals. And he put out a song called Black Tee, and it was edgier. And, you know, it was a direct mirrored imitation of that other rap group. And that song ended up sort of making his career in some ways. So that stage of mimetic rivalry sort of typically happens after mimetic desire has kind of progressed past its initial stages. And Girard calls it a double bind. And it especially happens when the person being imitated notices that they're being imitated. And then they start reacting back to the other person, right? So it'd be like if I'm, you know, a senior manager in my office, and I notice that, you know, somebody who's, you know, who directly works for me all of a sudden is like, comes into the office sort of like wearing nicer ties than me or whatever, and starts kind of like imitating a lot of my kind of proposals. And I start noticing that this person, you know, might be a potential rival. And then I sort of have my eyes on this person. And then it becomes imitation both ways, or it becomes mimesis both ways. And then that just escalates and makes us both rivals. And it takes it to another level when one person is just imitating somebody else and the person doesn't know that they're being imitated. There's nothing threatening about that. But once there's awareness of the imitation, all kinds of weird mimetic games start going on.
I think Rick had a question, and then we'll take Rob. Rick, did you have your hand raised?
I think it's still up. Move on to Rob.
Okay, Rob.
Cool. I'd be curious just to get your thoughts on how you see mimetic theory playing out in a leadership context, like whether you're, you know, trying to lead a company, whether you're trying to create positive change in a culture. And I think maybe the insights I'm really curious about and that are most applicable to me are One, recognizing unhealthy mimetic desires in the cultures that you care about, that you're trying to change, maybe breaking some of those cycles by modeling new, healthier, or like thick desires, as you talk about in the book. And then maybe bringing it back to scapegoating, like diffusing some of the, I don't know, mimetic rivalries or conflicts that show up in any culture just of their own accord without maybe necessarily scapegoating. There's a lot, but I think it all boils down to this just heading of leadership and what that looks like in a Girardian context.
Yeah, I don't know the backgrounds of everybody on this call. So if there's somebody that's been in this position that has some insights, please raise your hand. As a business leader myself, I think that I've just had a different view of how I view how I evaluate people that are in certain roles in my organization. I would have never told you this if you would have asked me, 10, 12 years ago, but one of the number one things or traits that I look for in somebody that's going to be in any kind of executive position or any kind of influential position in anything that I'm involved with, if I have any say about it, would be this person should be kind of have a non-rivalrous disposition, and we all know people that are people that take very quick offense and are sort of rivalrous in all of the wrong ways. It's one thing to be rivalrous with your competitor or something like the outside rivalry, but it's another thing to be rivalrous internally, to become an obstacle to other people progressing in their careers or something like that. I feel like in most organizations I've been a part of, I used to think intelligence and grit and hustle and all these things were the most important thing, but I can teach people almost everything. I mean, there's not a whole lot of things that I can't teach in most cases, unless it's a super technical position, but can't really teach that the sort of disposition of a person, right? And that sort of whether they're going to cause like absolute havoc based on the kind of struggle for power within the company. And there's ways to figure that out and to kind of sniff that out. I go into I've went into a few companies. Zappos is one of them. I tell that story in the book, and you just start asking around, especially with junior people, and you just have to have honest conversations where people feel safe sharing, and you quickly find out like who are the people that will cross you, if you challenge them in any way, right? Who are the people that are super passive aggressive. So I just put a premium on those kind of like soft skills that I wouldn't have earlier in my career. And Peter Thiel, when I talked to him, I think, this was one of his key insights, having been a student of Girard when he started PayPal. He, as a leader, he was just keenly aware of the power dynamics that were going on in the unwritten hierarchy of the organization. The one that, is kind of the hierarchy of desire, who wants what in this organization. If you can identify that, well, that's a tremendous insight. It's kind of like reading a book. One of the greatest keys to reading literature that I was ever given was try to identify what each character wants, at the beginning of a novel. And it's also a great way to write a book, right? If your characters have strong desires, the book almost writes itself, right? Especially if you understand mimesis a little bit. But apply that to a company. Really trying to get at that. It's a very complicated question, right? And you mentioned scapegoats too. If you don't understand that stuff, then I think the scapegoating just naturally happens. I saw it happen in the Downtown Project in Vegas. That's a story that I tell. And unfortunately, Tony himself kind of got made a scapegoat in that situation. I talk about some of the things that I think good leaders do that understand mimetic desire. But that's probably the most important one. It's not like, this is not like a quick hack. It's not just like, do this thing and you'll solve the mimetic problems in the organization. But it's just having this awareness that this is kind of the nature of desire, and then taking steps to not exacerbate it. For instance, by not encouraging people to compete for the same bullshit recognition within the company. People will literally do anything to get some of those accolades. You want people with sort of very clearly defined tasks, with a clear path forward for them in their career, so that they know that there's no zero-sum games, that the way that their career unfolds, their career development happens, does not have to be at the cost of anybody else, and that other people's path forward in the company is not going to come at their expense. And if people don't have the very sort of unrepeatable, unique vision of what their future looks like within an organization, then they sort of default to the mimetic rivalry stuff. So this is a question that I think comes down to vocation. In my words, I actually believe, like, the first thing that I want to do, I do this with my students, so this doesn't just apply to companies, it applies to education too, is helping identify, you know, a unique vocation that is not reliant on beating other people, because there's only one thing that you can do better than anybody else in the world, everybody on this call, and that's yourself. Be you and become who you are, and to do that. So nobody else will ever be better than you at that. And that's kind of one of the keys. And I don't think there's enough focus on that kind of personal development aspect within most companies.
Yeah,
Anna, you
those
want to go
are
ahead?
excellent points. And yeah, Anna.
Hi, thank you. Just wanted to add a little note to the executive not being territorial. There's this fantastic line in Canvas documentary, The Roosevelts, on FDR, that I keep thinking about whenever I see one of the captains of industry. One of the speakers says about Roosevelt that he was so egotistic that he was not threatened by anybody, so he could promote the best people. So he had the best White House. He didn't feel that anybody was his competitor. And there's, in this sense, in this organizational sense, there is such a benefit to having an outsized ego. And yeah, just grow it, guys. What anybody says, whatever anybody says.
Before we get into the next question, I wanted to ask one of my own and connect a couple of dots there. I think that you spoke quite a lot in your book, and you have tonight too, about the rivalries that take place in office spaces with essentially peers and neighbors. Does this sort of mimetic rivalry become worse or better or more enhanced or diminished depending on the accuracy of the information within that mimetic relationship? So to ask you another way, if you were to look at a closed system, something like an office, does sharing everyone's salaries in a workspace make things worse or better? Or does the implied imagination of the difference between different people in the different places do the same job, perhaps even worse? I think another way to look at that is what happens with social media, with things like Facebook and Instagram, where we put our best selves forward and we essentially imagine our rivalry, even with people that are still quite close to us, people that we grew up with, that we know in real life. There's a sort of mystique that's put into the system. Does an accurate measurement enhance or diminish that rivalry? Because we do know, that you also covered in your book, that we are most rivalrous with people who are close to us. But does the information being more accurate or less accurate, how does that factor into this? Have you looked at that at all?
There was an article, it's a great question. There was an article that I just read yesterday or the day before. Isn't a new policy being put in place in a country or a state or an industry where salary information has to be shared? Is anybody familiar with this? This was on one of the major news sites in the last 2 days.
I don't know what's new there, but I know some of the Scandinavian countries have dabbled with such things, that you have those registers where you can check out people's tax returns. I think we've got someone from Norway here tonight who can corroborate which of those countries does it exactly today. But I know these ideas have been explored to various degrees. I know some of the companies I consult with are considering doing that. It seems to be quite a sort of, people that come from a unionist type background do tend to push for more transparency in the salary space. I'm not sure what that does to resentment between groups, but yeah, I'll leave it back to you.
Resentment is the right word. Well, I'm pretty sure that it was in the States. If anybody has quick access to Google, you'll be able to find the article in 10 seconds probably. I believe it was either a state or an industry or something like that is putting into place that salary information has to be shared, lower and upper bounds at least. So I think I like that, right? Rather than everybody's salary is out there in the open, but at least if people know the lower and upper bounds, they know what range to negotiate rather than coming in completely blind. And I know there have been studies where people sort of like come in guessing, and certain like demographic groups like always kind of like settle for less than others, and it just creates a total mess, right? So I see two sides to it. I see on the one hand, if everybody knows how much everybody else is making and it's not equal, I could see how that could exacerbate problems, because now, you know, we have numbers to peg, and we're going to be constantly paying attention to that. On the other hand, it does solve a big problem. And I think you're absolutely right. Like, we project all kinds of things, invent stories in our head about other people. People try to signal their level of wealth or success to us. And we often we're usually way off from whatever the reality is. And that creates a vicious cycle. So I think that transparency in that sense would be helpful. I don't know what the long-term effects are. I mean, in a way, we're going to have to wait and see. But I think that my initial instinct was that I'm reading in the chat as I'm speaking. My instinct was that at least knowing the upper and lower ranges is probably a very good thing.
It's an interesting point. I suppose you could sort of interrogate that from a slightly different perspective. I don't know if I just overthink these things, but I think several people do. That almost the mystery that comes in from seeing and comparing your life to others through a screen or through a social media app, although it seems on the surface, when you start to look at this from a sort of initial level, trying to analyze society, that it would increase competition and dissatisfaction with our lives. And I know many analysts have written about that. But I do tend to wonder, particularly through the work that I do in the trend space, speaking to young people, if that mystery, that fact that we know, and that young people are not particularly stupid, they do know that everybody else is playing the same game they are because they're playing that game themselves. If that doesn't give ourselves as individuals an excuse for our lives not being as good as we want them to be in real life, because we can always say, oh, that other person that I'm comparing myself, they're also pretending. So it almost lets your ego off the hook a little bit. And I think that aspect perhaps hasn't been interrogated enough. I think this does frustrate me quite a lot about the discourse moving away from the office space towards what goes on in the world of social media, that not at the analysis looks at the superficial level and the easy sort of answers and the easy, again, scapegoats, but without thinking about how we play game theory with ourselves, you know, to make ourselves feel better about ourselves. And I'm not sure that aspect has been interrogated so much, which does get me to think, and I know that my general thesis looking at all these things, that in general, a bit of mystery and a bit of inaccuracy in the system works to more of our benefit than less. So I like what you were saying about salary bands, perhaps reducing some of the conflict in the system, but perhaps completely accurate information would end up doing the opposite, because it gives us nowhere to hide as to our own real place on the social ladder.
Mm-hmm. I think that's right. And it's sort of nice to be able to, I mean, the nature of wealth is very sort of mysterious. And it's usually very hidden. And I see a worrying trend, and I think there's some precedent for the transparency around wealth in the financial markets, and particularly crypto. It's part of the culture, actually, to share, you know, stock market gains or crypto gains, and even like the idea of loss porn, right? Where like you show like a huge loss that you've had. This is what was going on in Wall Street Bets on Reddit. That is news to me. I don't remember, I mean, before the last couple of years, I don't remember that being such a part of the culture. So I think that it's happening already in those spaces. And it certainly seems to me like it's actually accelerated or exacerbated mimetic desire and rivalry. I mean, one of the challenges, though, is, I mean, we don't have, you know, mimetic theory needs more sort of studies and sort of empirical evidence to show actually what's going on. That's something that I really hope, you know, I can contribute to in some way over the next few years. So we don't really know what the consequences of that are. I don't know if there's a good way to measure it. But there's that article that just came out in the Wall Street Journal about the studies at Facebook that were showing, that they know the bad effects of Instagram on adolescents. I think especially girls. So yeah, I mean, I think we're going to need a lot more. So I just don't know how to measure that, but it certainly seems on anecdotal evidence from the people that I've talked to, the environment of the last couple of years and that culture of sort of sharing doesn't allow people to tell themselves the kind of stories, right? There's a sour grapes kind of element to all of this too, right? Doesn't allow people to kind of shape the narratives that they might need to have some mental health.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I don't want to hijack this conversation too much, but I'm going to say one more thing, just because I can. Yeah. And that's what I think you didn't cover so much in your writing, but I have read about it quite a lot recently when it comes to mimesis, that some of the least healthy forms of this mimetic whole sort of journey that we send ourselves on, or when we end up comparing ourselves to idealized versions of ourselves. And I do tend to wonder if that is not perhaps where a lot of the deep harm from social media is coming from. And that there's been some really interesting pieces written on that, because that's a goal you're never able to attain, that comparing yourself to your idealized own self, comparing yourself to someone else, there's always some room to progress towards that goal, whether that's a celebrity or a peer. But when you're benchmarking yourself against a perfected version, a perfected, filtered, completely perfected version, it can become perhaps a more destructive sort of attainment. And we've seen this whether you're older people or younger people in terms of Snapchat and Zoom dysmorphias and plastic surgery trends and all the rest of it, like not being able to look ourselves in the eye, which I do think is an interesting sort of path to go down. That said, I should hand over. We do have a question. Surav, am I pronouncing your name right?
Yep.
Please correct me.
Thanks a lot. So Luke, coming back to your prior discussion around, like hiring someone in an executive position, who is kind of has a rivalry or rivalrous attitude, right? And I was wondering, you obviously described it rivalry or rivalrous attitude with, his peers and stuff like that, right? And what I was also wondering is, if you've ever looked into like how does that goes into kind of into his, maybe he reflects into his own team, in the sense, people like them many a times start taking credit for the work of one of their team members, or they start boosting their own egos or trying to cover up the work of the team members, and sometimes and taking credit for that and all those kind of things, right? Or even stop their growth and kind of trying to push himself in or herself in that position. And I was just wondering, if you have any thoughts around that.
Yeah. So, what is the question? I mean, I think I understand what you're saying. I know the people that do that. And I think I might have missed part of it because my Wi-Fi cut out a little bit. Sorry about that.
Right. So what I was wondering about is, if you have any thoughts around that specifically, and if that, kind of gels with whatever you were describing prior to that as well.
So especially the people that sort of appropriate things for themselves. This goes back to Bronwyn's point, I think, the definition of a narcissist, according to Girard, is somebody that has their model is an idealized version of themselves, right? And they'll never be able to surpass that. And that's kind of the tragedy of unhealthy mimetic desire, mimetic rivalry, because you literally there's no winning the game. The thing you think you want is always hidden under the only rock that's too heavy for you to lift. We're sort of almost obstacle addicts, right? If there's not an obstacle in our way, something's not valuable for us. And some of the best things in life are not necessarily hard. So I think there's a lot of pathology in organizations, Surav. I don't know. I mean, there's so much to talk about there. And I think the more specific cases, we have to talk about, the better. So I'm trying to think of a specific sort of case to make or around that specific point. But I think maybe I'll just open it up to the floor if anybody else has any experience there, has any points to share.
No one's biting, so I've got more questions if no one else does. But please do jump in. Otherwise, I can keep going all night long, and that would be rude. Okay, we've got a question.
I might have one which is related to the obstacle and whether we actually envy the obstacles of the other people, and whether underneath our preference for fighting for things that are in some ways hidden from us, how strong do you suspect mimetic desire to play a part?
Was the question around the obstacles of other people or other people as the obstacles?
The second version would be interesting to me as well, but I think the first one, all our heroes overcome obstacles, right? The hero's journey is filled with obstacles. All the stories we watch and read, all the motivational speakers have overcome something major, and that's the thing that gives us the goosebumps. There seems to be something almost sacrilegious about just going up to something and grabbing it, and we suspect a moral shortcoming on when somebody else does it, and something treacherous or fake when we achieve it, and we become kind of like thieves hiding when we get something too easily and we feel that we didn't earn it. So I'm just wondering, when we watch Titanic and Romeo and Juliet, do we envy? Do we covet the obstacles of others?
I think in the religious sense, that's absolutely the case. I mean, I grew up around various religious / cult adjacent various groups, so I can speak to this quite clearly. Like in a more sort of church or religious setting, your status is not attached to your material worth. It's attached to your purity or your faith or your belief or your relationship with your God or whatever it is that's the key center of that group. And in that context, status, certainly from what I observed, now, as I said, I sort of orbited around various of these different groups, well, with various different degrees of choice. It was always the one who had overcome the most sin or the most struggle or the most terrible things happening to them that had the greatest status in that community. And their pain and suffering and any sort of obstacle was a highly envied commodity, because it's what got you through the ranks of that group, and ironically actually got you material status at the end of it, because quite a lot of these particularly charismatic religious groups have quite good financial prizes at the end, and you got those prizes based on overcoming many obstacles, almost like a video game, which I can see quite sort of cynically from my vantage point right now. But I would absolutely agree with what you're saying, that it does become an object of envy in those circumstances. What would be more interesting for Luke to get into would be how that translates to the secular world if we play those same games in that space too.
Well, I want to stay with the religious aspect, because I think that will segue very well into the secular world. Just to play devil's advocate with you, it's not always the case. There are some like very, very popular, Christian saints. Thinking of a Catholic saint, Saint Teresa of Lisieux, is very popular and was known for how like she never sort of committed a serious sin in her whole life. So it's actually the opposite. It's, she sort of like maintained this level of purity, and she doesn't have the hero's journey in the Campbell sense of like overcoming, this great sinfulness and having this, great conversion experience like a Saint Francis of Assisi or something like that.
But wasn't she persecuted? Don't you have to be persecuted to make sainted?
You don't have to be persecuted. No.
You don't have to anymore.
No,
Okay,
don't,
good.
you don't have
I don't
to.
know too much about the Catholic side of things.
Yeah. So there, I do, and there's a saying in, in Christianity, and I'm Christian, that is like, everybody, well, carry your cross is the phrase, right? Carry your cross, which is, you sort of like deal with the burdens that you've been giving, and everybody wants another cross, right? Somebody else's cross, because it looks like it would be easier to carry. And sort of the old, spiritual wisdom is like, don't try to pick up anybody else's cross. You carry the one that you've been given, and if you, and that cross, by the way, that looks nicer to carry, lighter, it might have some glossy diamonds on it or whatever. Like once you get that cross, you're probably not going to like it very much. It might even be heavier than the one that you have right now, right? So carry your cross. And I think there's something, this is heavily related to this idea of the obstacles and the addiction to obstacles, and sometimes the fascination with other people's obstacles. So let's just jump to the secular kind of discussion now. I think that might frame it up somewhat well, because I think a similar thing kind of happens. There's almost I don't know if anybody on the call knows anybody like this. There are some people who, and I share this because I have been like this before, where if I am about to achieve something that came really easy, I start to get super skeptical and like self-sabotage myself. Earlier in life, that would be, or, like if I'm able to like, get a girl to go on a date with me, like, and it's too easy, I'm like a little skeptical. I'm like, why is she like into me? Like something's wrong here. I didn't have to work very hard at that. So there's all kinds of sort of games that we play with ourselves, like mental tricks that we play when this goes on. I think there's almost a Kantian ethic that we have, especially Americans. And it's this idea that, the harder that something is, the more valuable or worthwhile it was, which is the exact opposite of what, the in scholastic philosophy would define a virtue, is like the more you possess a virtue, the easier a thing is to do. The Kantian ethic is the exact opposite, right? It's sort of, there's more merit if it's harder to do. And that it's almost an addiction to obstacles. I think that there is sort of an addiction to obstacles, and we look at other people that have overcome these great things as part of Silicon Valley sort of lore and mythology and the stories that we tell. Notice there always has to be some great obstacle that was overcome. You'll pretty much like never encounter an origin story of any company that didn't have a huge obstacle. Like Groupon might be an exception to that. If everybody remembers Groupon, that they started in 2008 and they reached $1 billion in 18 months, and it's like seems like nothing went wrong. They just like started it up. You never heard any stories. It's the only exception that I can literally think of in all of my years of listening to founders tell me stories of how they started their company. So I think we need to sort of get under this, and there's a fascinating discussion here about sort of Girardian mythology and cover-ups of violence and stuff. But I think that we are attracted to obstacles and also to other people's obstacles, and other people glamorize their obstacles. And I think that's something to be very careful of, because we will encounter our own and we don't need to go out looking for them.
I think Peter had his hand raised, and so does Kiku.
Hey, it's a bit of a sort of subject changer, so I don't know if anyone wants to take the chance to just dive in and follow that thread, or should I go for it? Okay, I actually have like several really burning questions, but I'm just going to throw out one. So in a footnote to chapter 4, you quote from Crime and Punishment at quite some length. You're quoting Raskolnikov's dream. And in the dream, something happens such that people lose their ability to agree, and society just gradually, or even rather quickly, falls apart. So I guess I'd like to just hear you talk a little bit about the mimetic desire and political theory. It just so happened that before I started reading your book, I was thinking a bit about Thomas Hobbes and kind of wondering what he might say about like politics in the Middle East right now, or indeed the last, I don't know what, 100 years. And Hobbes has this idea of like the Leviathan, And the sort of central role of the Leviathan is, let's see, to be this kind of ultimate enforcer who sort of creates conditions for peace and sort of stable order. Because for Hobbes, there's this idea that like, if you don't have somebody with this kind of pretty ultimate power to kind of lay down the rules of like, you know, structurally in some relatively thin sense, like this is like kind of fundamentally how we're going to do things, how we're going to sort of structure society, how we're going to resolve disputes, like what kinds of laws we're going to have, and you know, what sort of legal judgment calls are going to be made. Hobbes thinks this is like totally critical. The connection to mimetic theory for me is like this suggestion sort of that there might be such a thing as kind of too much pluralism. That like, in a sense, there's just so much up for grabs about kind of what things we might value and want as, you know, collectively. And at a certain point, you need to do some kind of like, okay, well, we're just gonna, there's sort of no like real grounds for saying this, but we're just gonna all sort of agree to like roughly, you know, go along with some idea like, I don't know, a Christian notion of equality or something like that. And yeah, this seems like, I don't know, I guess I'm curious to just hear you riff on this, and if you think there's anything to this kind of comparison with Hobbes, in terms of like what Girard would make of all this.
I mean, yeah, it's an excellent point. And Girard talks about Hobbes a lot in The War of All Against All. And it's a critical, I think was heavily influenced by Hobbes' idea of a war of all against all, which is the definition of a mimetic crisis. And the Leviathan, or, you know, in Carl Schmitt's terms, the monarch, the ruler, the king is sort of really important. It's he who decides the exception, and you know, sort of like he who might be able to prevent a crisis from further escalating when, you know, the people are all begin to resemble each other. There's a loss of distinctions. It's unclear who to listen to, who not to, who the models are, and sort of just like dissolves into this sort of like Lord of the Flies scenario until there's somebody with authority to come back in, who has the authority to decide exceptions, to decree things. So there's a case to be made for that. I think it might be helpful for anybody that's not familiar, you know, and thank you for referencing that passage from Crime and Punishment. Would it be helpful if I just read just a little bit of it so people have an idea? Okay. So I happened to pull it up because I was betting that somebody might actually ask about that. And thank you for reading the footnotes. So this is, you know, from Crime and Punishment. This is written in the 1860s, and this is at the very end of the book. It's a dream by Raskolnikov. And here's what Dostoevsky writes. He dreamt that the whole world was condemned to a terrible new strange plague that had come to Europe from the depths of Asia. All were to be destroyed except a very few chosen. Some new sorts of microbes were attacking the bodies of men, but these microbes were endowed with intelligence and will. Men attacked by them became at once mad and furious, but never had men considered themselves so intellectual and so completely in possession of the truth as these sufferers. Never had they considered their decisions, their conclusions, their moral convictions so infallible. I'll skip a little bit right now. Each thought that he alone had the truth and was wretched looking at the others. They did not know how to judge and could not agree what to consider evil and what good. They did not know who to blame or who to justify. So this is from Dostoevsky, you know, 150 years ago. It's pretty haunting and somewhat prophetic. So, you know, I included this because I finished the book right after the pandemic had started, and I happened to Crime and Punishment was, I think, the last fiction that I had read, and that dream struck me tremendously when I read it. So, you know, I think what, you know, Girard, when he read this passage, he said, you know, he's basically describing a mimetic crisis where there's a loss of distinction in a society, and it's unclear who to trust. It's unclear who has authority. And in this case, I think this is why in these kinds of situations, forms of fascism start to look attractive. It's why, if you look at history, somebody kind of like steps up and says, I'll be in charge. So I think there's a lot of stuff that we could say. I know there's at least one other hand raised, so I don't want to monopolize, but I think that the connection to Hobbes, to answer the question very specifically, is that Hobbes talked about a war of all against all. And in Girardian terms, the war of all against all is what happens when mimetic rivalry is spread through contagion. Everybody's imitating everybody else. And there's a loss of any kind of sort of transcendent model. Could be God, it could be a king or a ruler, somebody that stands outside of. They have to stand outside of the war of all against all in order to do anything about it. And that would be a situation where one could make a case for some kind of a Leviathan.
I had a question for you. So I tend to think of mimesis in like a negative connotation, like it causes us to, chase after the same things, and then it causes crises and conflict. I also like sometimes think of it as a vulnerability that that's part of us, where we want the same things other people want, and it can kind of run amok, like with all these like hype trains and people just copying each other, and then it sort of develops into these manias. But I was wondering if you've come across any like reframing of it in a positive light. Like, are there ways we can use mimesis or our tendencies to imitate to kind of like better ourselves, or to like understand this vulnerability but use it as a strength somehow?
That was Tiki. Thank you. Girard was notoriously dark and almost had nothing to say about positive mimesis. So it's only been in the last 10 years or so that some people have started to talk about it, because it's debatable, or it's at least a point of contention, how much of desire is mimetic. Is all of desire mimetic? I think most Girard scholars would say that all human desire, I mean, it depends on how we define desire, right, is mimetic. So if that's true, and it might be an interesting discussion, we could have a discussion like, is there non-mimetic desire? But if it's true that all desire is mimetic, right, things that we don't, non-instinctual wants, things that are non-instinctual, if it's true that it's all mimetic, then I hope there's something like positive mimesis, because if there's not, then it seems like a sort of it seems like a very deterministic sort of like idea, right? Like we're just sort of like doomed to get caught into rivalries or something. I probably have highlighted positive mimesis, I think, more than most. I mean, it's the whole second half of the book. I'm trying to make an attempt at having that discussion about what it might look like. I mean, I think we see, the role of positive models in education, whether you've had a teacher, a coach, or a leader or a parent, the kind of, and I use the example of like Montessori education in the book, an example of positive mimesis, where the actual training, the approach is to model a desire for learning in some domain, or to learn more about some object, and then the teacher removes themselves, so that there's no longer any mediation. There's just sort of direct contact between the student and the thing that they're learning. So it's almost, it's almost as if she like had read Girard. Of course, she lived before Girard did, but it's almost as if she had like mimetic theory in mind, right? She's very, very much thinking about obstacles to learning and education. So to just say that, sure, like having positive role models, that's an overly simplistic way to look at it. But we do know that desire is powerfully shaped by other people. And there are so many different aspects of positive mimesis. I think that there are aspects of it, even with, people look at TikTok, for instance, and we only see like the negative side of it. But I see positive mimesis actually happening on some of the social media platforms. I mean, it's actually allowed unknown artists to generate, a ton of interest and get known when nobody would have paid them any attention at all, if they had to go through the traditional gatekeepers. So, and I think that's happening in Web3. I think it's happening in crypto. I think that, people can use positive mimesis to accomplish great things. I mean, I certainly don't have any kind of like prescriptive advice on that. But I think that it certainly is a possibility, and it's extremely important.
Kelsey,
And
you
there's a
have your hand
there's a religious discussion we could get into around this too, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Kelsey, go ahead.
Just an example as a positive one that's kind of close to what we're all doing is I think the intellect does this on Twitter, because you kind of like see everybody talking, doing things, you take pictures, you're like, what's happening there? They're chatting about fun things. So I think the intellect uses it in a hopefully positive way.
Yeah, Vincent?
Hey, Luke, you highlight market economies as one way to mitigate the negative consequences of mimesis. And I wonder, have you seen any differences in the way mimesis manifest in cultures that don't revolve around property rights? Like I'm thinking about like indigenous groups. Like, is there less of a, this desire manifests itself differently? So I know needs, there's a difference between needs and desires, but some groups have like an inverted hierarchy of needs compared to Maslow. And yeah, curious on your thoughts.
Wow, property rights and private property. I've only lived really in sort of relatively free market kind of capitalist economies. So this might be somebody else that has more insight into this than I do. There's I don't know is the basic answer, and I wish I had a better one than that. I know there's a book called Radical Markets. Has anybody read that book on the call? That sort of proposes sort of auctions and sort of public goods and auctioning off I think some private property. I don't know. I just haven't thought enough about that. But it's something that I mean, I would like to explore and understand how it works in non-market economies.
I wonder. Translates. I don't think it's purely to do with financial gains or property at all, because you take those away and you've still got these sort of envy feedback loops. Just attach that value to different things, whether it's a social credit or financial credit. I can definitely say that those things translate across whether we've got market economies or not. Although market economies in some ways simplify it, like we were talking about earlier, because the points are obvious. In fact, that might be a reason why we have embraced market economies. It allows us to know where we stand on social hierarchies to a simple number. So it's like playing a game. You've got an actual score. It's harder in societies without those numbers to see where you are in the whole hierarchy of things. But that also when it becomes a bit more violent when you start to sort of unroll these whole issues. I know you was talking earlier about the whole scapegoat mechanism and mimesis and how they're like two parts, but they're not quite. They can be separated a bit. They weren't separated in Gerard's world, but he kind of brought them together. I don't know who here has come across the Golden Bough, which I think it was quite a pivotal text from what I read, and how it connected the ideas of Gerard with the ideas of religion, with the ideas of mimetic theory and market theory and everything else. It kind of connected some of those gaps in between. That really does go into the detail of that whole scapegoat envy mechanism, but in very primitive societies in quite great detail. So for me, I think it would be quite obvious that it does play out. I wonder if the market economy doesn't actually limit rather than exacerbate some of those tendencies for us.
Yeah, great point. I I guess my question was more around cultures that do more of the meditative thinking versus the calculating thought that I think, Luke, you have a chapter on. For example, if like a group as the base of their pyramid, they have self-actualization, and for them that is in the sense of how do I fit into this community, and that's how they start building up their pyramid of needs. You know, it's like you have a chapter that mentions Heidegger and Ian McGilchrist. And McGilchrist talks about left and right hemisphere dispositions, and left hemisphere is kind of more like about division and seeing the world in parts and control and grasping in language. So grasping kind of reminds me of desire. And then he has the right hemisphere, which is kind of like wholeness, interconnectedness, and context. Yeah, so I guess I'm curious about what a world might look like where the culture kind of has more awareness of that interconnectedness and interdependence and that meditative thought that you write about.
My closest contact, yeah, Vincent, I think this is a great question. And I'm in real time, I'm just thinking seriously about, and thank you for mentioning the meditative versus calculating thought. So this just reminds me that, you know, I've spent a significant amount of time inside monasteries, for instance, you know, and this is an example of a community that has a very different sort of model of desire, hierarchy of desire, right? It's not based on a market economy, for instance. In some ways, you know, in a lot of religious communities, like all the goods are shared, you know, nobody has bank accounts, everything goes to the order or something like that. Even when they go give talks, it just goes, so it's everything is shared in common. And I think in these kinds of communities, it does, you know, the mimetic rivalry or the mimetic desire does sort of just manifest itself in other ways. In other words, you know, I don't know if there's any political system or economic system that like is going to just help us to live, you know, happy sort of mimetic lives. It manifests itself in weird rivalries over, you know, like who you know kneels lower when they pray and stuff like that, you know. So it doesn't quite go away, but I think and one of the in that whole chapter in the book, Vincent, I mean, I'm sort of talking about the difference between the sort of top-down approaches to like engineer some kind of system that would be ideal for, you know, a world with a bunch of, you know, mimetic people living in it, right? Like, is there a certain political system or economic system that is better? And I was sort of warning against the idea that we can do that. That it has to come from the bottom up, right? It has to, because we're not going to be able to engineer some of the problems related to mimesis or mimetic desire away. But that's not to say that there aren't certain things that could be better or worse or exacerbate it or lead to conditions where people are incentivized to develop healthy relationships. It's a really tough question. Something you know, the book just leaves it open. So I'm glad you asked it. And I'd like to understand if there are any models out there that I don't know about, where there is that seem to lend themselves to really healthy community formation, where people have been able to avoid the kind of scapegoating, rivalrous tendencies that we have. And if anybody solves that problem with, like, for instance, how to build a company with company structure, that's something that I've always sort of had this idea, like, well, you know, maybe I could, you know, build, and it's actually probably, I think this is a temptation, because in some ways I kind of wanted to do exactly what Tony Hsieh tried to do. You know, create a culture that is different, that, you know, that where everybody is sort of happy and doesn't have these problems. And he actually ended up creating something that might have been quite the opposite. And it was kind of a warning to me to kind of resist the temptation that, based on the way, you know, that the policies that I put in place, that I can somehow solve problems that at root are personal things that people need to figure out for themselves.
Tiki, you had your hand raised.
Oh, I'm sorry. That was from before. I'll put it down.
I've got another question. I can jump in there. I know you were talking earlier about the lighter side of mimesis, but I think you can go even darker too. I know that's generally the thesis when you talk about it, it's wanting what other people want. But isn't there also an argument to be made that perhaps it's even darker than that it goes even deeper, and that is that we want other people not to have what they want. Like, I've read quite deeply into the whole topic of envy, which goes a bit broader and weirder places than mimetic theory itself. And I think that that's quite an interesting point, because when you talk about envy as opposed to jealousy or mimesis, envy seems to be that really core human emotion. And it's a dark emotion in that it can be satisfied not by even accomplishing getting what you want, as long as you're preventing the other person or the objects of your competition from actually accumulating that object for themselves. So as opposed to jealousy, where you kind of do want to keep control of the objects of desire, with really dark envy, you could get to the point where you just don't want anyone to actually succeed. So it becomes a more conservative way of looking at this whole topic rather than a progressive way, because mimetic theory is about progress, for better or for worse. It's about movements and motion and moving on and chasing that tail and chasing that whole process forward. I don't know if you've thought about it like that at all, or if you have any comments on the distinction between envy, mimesis, and jealousy, or if you have thought about that at all.
I have, and just one comment. I'm reading a tweet right now by one Bronwyn Williams from this morning or no, actually, I think it was last night. And you put it better than I could put it. There's a study that says we can say categorically that young people across the world, whether rich, poor, north, south, east, or west, believe in connectivity, mobility, and sustainability as their three cardinal virtues. And you say, can we though? Or is it just what you want them to want? I thought that was, I don't know if this salon was on your mind or not, but I thought that was a nice turn of phrase, right? Like, how often do we want people to want things and then project things onto them? And this is actually related to the last question. We come to sort of engineering desire and imposing things onto other people, because mimetic theory sort of comes down to the will and the extent to which we're willing to impose our desires on other people, or view their desires as a threat to us. So it has everything to do with freedom too. Now, on the question of jealousy and envy, Girard famously said the reason that our culture talks so much about sex is because nobody wants to talk about their envy, and that envy is like the most pervasive vice or sin in culture. Some probably more than others. Okay, and I think he's right. Envy is something that is hidden. Almost nobody talks about it. It's what Dostoevsky sort of called the underground, right? It exists in the underground. So Notes from the Underground man is in Dostoevsky is a man who basically has like opted out and wants to become the supreme individualist, and essentially like lives his life sabotaging himself and just envious of everybody and more other focused than ever. He just can't stand everybody he comes into contact with bothers him in some way, and it ends in total disaster. So it's the sort of one of the parables of that story is like this retreat into this individualism is paradoxically causes us to just become more concerned with everybody else as our sense of identity is formed over and against other people. The difference between jealousy and envy for me is here's a simple definition. Jealousy is not necessarily a bad thing. It's wanting what somebody else has. So, you know, in the Bible, for instance, it's even said that God is a jealous God, because, you know, he wants all of your love, not just some of it. So, you know, and if you love somebody else more than God, he's jealous. And in other words, he deserves or wants all of it. So even God himself is called a jealous God. That's saying he wants what your idol has. Okay, is one way that you could interpret that. And I could think of all kinds of, you know, I could use the word jealous in a positive sense. You know, there's a friend that I have, is just a great human being. I just admire his character, and you know, he's his loving husband and great father, and I'm sort of jealous of his life, his happiness, and his character, and I want that, and me forming some of those things is great, right? It in no way deprives him of any of those things, right? I'm not taking, it's not a zero-sum game. So in that sense, like, it's a form of, I'll just call it healthy jealousy. Okay. Envy is wanting somebody else to not have something, or the only way that I have a sense of satisfaction is if somebody else doesn't have something. And I actually get, I have a sense of satisfaction when I see somebody like lose something that they have, right? It's we have this fascination in American culture where like bad things happen to people and everybody has this like kind of like pumps their fist and it's like they had it coming, you know? And that's an odd thing. And I wonder if there's some kind of envy at the root of that. Now, a lot of people have their hands up. So this is a hot topic apparently, so I'll shut up.
Well, we've got, I think the order was Peter, Anna, and Jacob. Feel free to chime in that order.
I think others are probably reacting to that thread. So they should.
I think, Peter, you either muted yourself or you cut off.
Oh, sorry. Hello. Can you hear me? I was just saying that I think probably others should go first because I'm just the guy who keeps bringing up new things.
Anna and Jacob?
Yes, thank you. I will bring up new things, by the way. One of my favorite books on dramaturgy is David Mamet's 3 Uses of the Knife, in which it's an 80-page long essay on storytelling. And one of the things that he says that I think about almost every day is that every single scene in any story, any book, any whatever format you chose, has to be able to answer 3 questions. Who wants what from whom? What happens if they don't get it? Why now? Kind of to go back, Luke, to your Silicon Valley deck storytelling. I mean, it's the same thing, right? Like there was a problem in Mordor, and then Frodo, this startup, came out of nothing. Nobody thought he would do it, and he did it. So it just kind of as a joke, but in many, many ways, and this is why, you know, to go back to the Old Testament, wanting things is restricted in the 10 Commandments. Not just doing things, but wanting them, thinking about it. And, you know, in some, you know, Christian schools, thought crime is crime. And I think about how scary it is to see somebody wanting something. I mean, there's a reason why the couple where the guy looks at the other girl has become the greatest meme of the world, right? I mean, this is what you don't want to see. And there's this animalistic reaction to seeing this spark in the eyes of somebody when you see the thought in their eyes that they now want. But also I'm thinking about how easy it is to misunderstand, because what we see is our own sin, right? In Hungarian, in my mother tongue, there is this fantastic expression that doesn't exist in English, which means to start from yourself. So for instance, you say like, oh, you are going to go out to smoke, and you say, don't start from yourself, meaning don't think that I am like you. But that's what we do. I have Peter Easton, who co-hosts That Economy Society with Bronwyn here, once gave me a therapy session where he only used game theory. And I said, like, I have this very complicated situation at work. I was working at a startup in London, and I was like, it's so complicated. There are all the fields. Let's sit down and look at like utility functions, like what's going on here. I was in a rivalry with somebody. And we went and tracked back how actually we want completely different things and we're working toward completely different goals, but my behavior is confusing this guy. So he thinks that I was working on building my own company and he was working on being promoted. And I remember it was after 1 year of suffering with this person. We were even in the same office and it was really difficult. And somehow the culture of the company didn't allow for it to be openly discussed. And then I remember sitting there and thinking like, oh my God, because he starts from himself. He thinks that my proactivity, that my reading 0 to 1 after hours, whatever, is because I want to get promoted or I want to, show off to the boss, where I didn't even think about the boss anymore. I was already registering domains, right? And this always reminds me in my private life, for instance, that when I'm like, I'm sure he looked at her with whatever, like, I don't know. Like, you don't really, but you don't know. And just kind of as I always think about the utility function that I had with the marketing guy. Every time I think I know somebody. But yesterday, Luca, when you were doing the prep call, I mentioned that, envy in my reading has a positive aspect to it, which is that it tells you what you want. And in a much more, because jealousy can manifest in so many different ways. It can manifest in, I want to be your best friend, or let's throw a party so I can see all my boyfriend's friends, but envy is a stab in your heart. There's no rationalizing it and you know it. And then you know what you want. And I think if you're smart, you can use it for, self-honesty, right? And we see it. I mean, I'm in my 30s, and I think your 30s are it is the decades of envy. And it's really shocking to me, and not just financially, but this is where you make statements about your priorities with your life decisions, right? And yes, everybody can have everything, but not at the same time. What do you do first? For instance, do you start a family? Do you start a company? Do you try to do both? Do you move to a big city? Do you move out to the countryside? Do you go back to academia? Like you make these kind of monstrous choices. And there's this constant, little devil, little Girard sitting on your shoulder, asking questions. And it's always so easy to find somebody who made another choice and upon a superficial glance might be looking to be doing better. And my own private kind of psychological exercise that I do whenever I feel, thankfully it's much less frequently happening to me now, but there was a time in my life when I felt envy very strongly, in my late 20s. And I always sat down and looked at holistically at the life of this person. Like, would I really want everything in their life? Would I want their mom? Would I want their height? Would I want their bookshelves? Like, it's all of those other questions. And then you're like, no, I'm good. I want my bookshelves, it's fine. And suddenly like all the other aspects also kind of moved back into place. And yeah, I agree with Luke and Bronwyn that Instagram and it's, picking up on one aspect in somebody's life doesn't help. Right. And we even do this with our body. Like there is this typical beach look that young women, for instance, do on Instagram. And it's phenomenology. It's about not seeing 70% of that person, right? And that's even without the Photoshop and the filtering. So yeah, let's figure out a better solution for young women to compete on the dating markets than filter amputation.
Thank you, Anna. As you were speaking, one of the things that just jumped out at me is our mimetic desire, our envy, our jealousy, our rivalries. they're all sources of information and self-discovery and learning more about ourselves and what it is that we want. There's a saying in the Christian, sort of spiritual tradition that, you only see sin in other people if you have it in yourself. This reminds me of the Hungarian saying in a certain sense. Or another way to put that in a non-religious sense is often like the things that bother us the most in the culture or in other people are in some sense like the things that we should be asking ourselves why, right? In some sense we might be grappling with some of the same problems ourselves. Otherwise, why would it bother? So there's something. So the point is, all of these things, if we have awareness and we're willing to do the work, including envy, tell us something important about ourselves and what we do want. And there's a level of honesty that comes with that. And then the really important point is like having conversations with people that clear up all of the things we've been projecting on them and them on us, like you and your and the guy that you worked with in the startup, right? Like sometimes when you sit down and just have an open and honest conversation, this applies to romantic relationships too, right? There are many spouses that are in like mimetic rivalries with one another. So there's a Girardian therapist, psychologist. My French is terrible, but it's Jean-Michel Orgullien. Basically calls them seesaw teeter-totter relationships, or one person can only be up if the other person's down. And he basically says it's a mimetic rivalry. And it's because people are constantly sort of like people don't like to be open and honest about what it is that they desire sometimes, right? This happens in romantic relationships and it happens in companies. And in general, I think that more transparency is a good thing, certainly in personal relationships, but probably even in organizations as well. I hate the analogy of saying that we're like a family in an organization. I don't think it makes any sense. Like, no, we're not. Like, if you're not doing your job, like I'll terminate you. Like, I'm not going to terminate my child. Like, it's totally different. But there is, I think, a sense where we even organizations could benefit from more transparency, the way that it benefits families and relationships.
I love it. I would just like to add one point to the self-honesty aspect, which is that if we posit that jealousy and envy carry incredibly important information about ourselves, then finding out, or at least probing whether they are fully mimetic, I think is so important. And I think one of the reasons why people are so drawn to Girard is because we are so worried that we are kind of an internal matrix, right? Like, what if you started digging down and found that your deepest fears, hopes, loves, desires are not even yours? And we all have that, right? I mean, that's why we read books and dress differently from one another and create all these layers of individuality, because Kundera writes about the fact that, our greatest secrets are the secrets that everybody has, right? Like, everybody in this room has the same secrets, or at least the same categories. And we are super ashamed of that, right? Because it means that, either you don't have free will, or that humans are actually, constructed from just a couple of Legos, and we are all the same Legos. And it's very hard to, then how do you explain that your husband is your husband and not somebody else? How do you explain where you live and what life you chose, right? And so there's this really interesting constantly being drawn to sameness and copying one another, and then pushing it away and running away from it. Because if you actually follow that thought to its completion, then you end up with the atoms. And yeah, okay, it's true, like your atoms, but it also, you feel that it would be, on the one hand, very nihilistic and sad. On the other, it doesn't really answer the question, right? You can't really explain Kelsey with atoms. You can, but like the kind of information you get will tell you very little about what she's going to do next, for instance.
Should we move on to Jacob's question?
Yeah, we're almost at the end of our 2 hours, so let's move on to Jacob.
Okay, so I've been hearing there's been sort of like drips of entrepreneurial and organizational talk, and we heard about the marketing guy that Anna had had a thing with and so
I
on.
hope he's not going to watch this
And
video. I saw it will be so obvious to him that this is him. I only had this once in my life, and then Peter Easton taught me how to draw the, utility functions.
great. So I've been thinking that I also sort of fundamentally believe that people respond to incentives, right? So I was just wondering, Luke, if you were to start a new company today or a new organization of any kind, how would you design the incentives that would go into that, knowing what you know about mimetic desire and the the good and the upsides and the downsides that mimetic rivalry or lack thereof can lead to? You mentioned that you would look for non-rivalrous people to fill leadership positions. Are there anything else that you might think of, either in terms of who you would want to get on board, and also how you would go about incentivizing them?
Thanks for the question, Jacob. It's pertinent because I am, in fact, seriously, I mean, I have something in stealth mode right now, so that I unfortunately I can't really talk about the details of it. So I don't know how helpful I would be. And if I told you my whole HR system, then everybody would just copy it, and then it would just be in a mimetic mess. I believe in incentives too, right? I mean, I think financial incentives are important. So that's certainly, important part of it. It's not like both and, like we're all just happy here and I can, pay you way under market or something like that. There's some companies that really operate like that. I know so many that operate like that. It's kind of like the old, like, artists kind of thing where, like, you do some work for me and, it'll be so fulfilling that, I don't need to pay you or something like that. Right. So I think incentives are important. I think there's an aspect, and I'm sorry, I'm going to speak in cryptic Straussian terms here because there's certain things that I'm still working. First of all, I'm just working it out still, and some of it I don't feel confident enough to quite share. But hopefully in the next year, it'll be a little bit more evident. I think that there are some of the principles from like the decentralization that we're seeing. With in crypto and with the blockchain, with Web3 stuff. I think some of those principles, I don't think anybody's really applied some of those principles to organizational design and structure yet. But I think that there's a way to sort of to do that. I think that in a certain sense, like holacracy, which is the management system that Zappos has tried to implement. I think Medium tried to implement it as well, and they're both using it to varying degrees. I think that they were trying to do that, but I don't think that it really worked because I think it gets human nature a little bit wrong. So one of the basic principles, and this is part of the work that I do at the university too, and the Center for Entrepreneurship, is comes down to really it comes down to a more intense focus on an individual's sort of unique sense of mission than I think any company has ever done. I don't think that that's really something that companies really focus on. So if you're like a creator in the crypto space or something like that, you really feel this sense of ownership. You have like a sense of personal mission that you can articulate, and there's space for you to pursue that. And this is why people call it the Great Resignation. I think people are really struggling to connect their passion to create with the organizational structures that they're in, and there are very few that know how to somehow find an intersection between the two. Because you can't run a company where everybody just goes and does what they want all the time, but there is, I think there is a place where they meet. And it comes down to, taking the people and their sense of meaning very seriously, like through not just when you're hiring them, but like throughout the entire process, because when people start to lose meaning, they become disengaged, and then they become actively disengaged. The Gallup, study on active disengagement is ridiculous, right? I mean, it's something like over 20% of people are actively disengaged. I mean, that doesn't just mean that they're unplugged. It means that they're like actually trying to subvert the things that the organization is doing. And I think that stems from a lack of knowing people. And that's why I devote so much time in the book to getting to know people a lot more intimately than obviously taking an appropriate level of self-disclosure into account, much more intimately than most organizations are willing to do. So sorry, that's very high level, but I think that there are ways to do that. If I didn't, then I wouldn't be trying to do it. And the entrepreneur in me now wants to see if I can actually put some of these principles into practice in the real world.
Thank you.
All right, I think we're practically at the end of the hour. Rick, did you have a question?
More just a comment, and just in terms of, I wanted to kind of share a couple of ways in which my reading of Girard has practically made a difference in my life, just kind of like, on ground level. And one of them is, I have this distinction that I call having the Girardian flu, which is when I find myself particularly miserable about by envy, I kind of imagine it as being similar to having a cold or having a flu. You know you're going to be sick for a while. You're going to be miserable, but you won't be miserable forever. And if you look at the things that you are envious about, and this happens to me even though I'm nearly 70 and well through my life, but I found just having the distinction of, okay, this is just, I'm miserable with envy about somebody, but it's not going to last forever. And eventually you do kind of get over it, or the sting of it becomes less miserable. That was one thing. And then the other thing that I've really found that has been very helpful about reading Girard is the possibility of just giving in. And just, if you find yourself in an envious rivalry with somebody, there's always the possibility of just giving up and giving in. And Girard talks a lot about this as a way out of the mimetic disorder conundrum, which is that you can just give people what they want. And, I notice that we have this reaction against that as a possibility because we would just be a doormat. We just become a doormat for people. But I found that it's a lot easier many times to just give in to people, and it makes the envy go away. So anyways, I just wanted to kind of, when someone was talking about, well, empirically, how would we put these philosophical concepts into action? Those are two real world ways in which I do it in my own life. Thanks.
Can I ask how does giving in look? So say, I don't know, like to use like a very dumb
usually
example.
I think there's a quote somewhere by Girard where he says, when you find yourself in mimetic rivalry with somebody, it's usually because you both want the same thing. Like, let them have the extra piece of cake. Try and identify what that person desires and then just give them. Maybe it's a promotion at work. Maybe it's a certain client that they have a relationship with. Maybe another way I often find is complimenting people. People are often agitated about some sort of acknowledgement or praise for their role in something. And I notice that when you're envious, you're kind of a little stingy with that stuff. You don't want to. So one way to give in is to be very lavish in the acknowledgement and praise of somebody you're in a rivalry for. Make sense?
Yeah. The biblical version of that is, if somebody asked you for your coat, you give them your cloak too. If somebody asks you to run 1 mile, you run 2 miles, right? It's the anti-memetic response.
And I think Gerard says that Christ meant that very literally. We tend to think of it in our culture as being, we tend to think of that character that's in Matthew, I think, right? Mm-hmm. We tend to think of it as metaphorically, but I think Christ was actually saying, yes, give in. Look at the possibility of giving in to somebody you're in conflict with. Now, obviously, it brings up all sorts of issues, but I find that it's a lot easier to give in once you start to do it than you think it is before you actually do it. Anyways.
May I react to this, or are we running out of time too much? Yes? Then I will send an email. Share
if people have to leave, you're welcome to leave. We are at the end of the 2 hours, but we've got a bit of buffer time. So for those of you that want to stick around.
Yeah, and that's also contingent on how much time Luke has left with us. So we're happy to stick around.
I'm happy to stick around until another 22 minutes, so 4:30 my time.
Wonderful. Well, Anna, did you want to react in that case?
Yeah, and I think this is an interesting, I never thought about this, so in my experience with people, the envy that becomes the real toxic component in life is not something that I have. The problem with giving in is that it posits that envy is a moment, right? I give my cloak, I applaud somebody's promotion. But I think for most people, envy manifests as ressentiment throughout an extended period. So envy is, your neighbor getting a promotion and renovating the house and your house looking terrible, and you having to go home to that house every day, and he or she getting into their wonderful car and you getting into your worst car. And every day. And it's a little bit like a bad habit that is waiting on you having a low immune system moment, right? Something else goes awry in your life, and suddenly your house looking worse is unbearable. This is how Anna Karenina starts, right? We don't learn that Anna Karenina has fallen in love with Vronsky. She goes home and thinks her husband is ugly. She didn't think that yesterday, but now she wants the other guy. And probably she subconsciously registered way earlier than she doesn't like Karenin's ears, but this wasn't a problem until tonight after the ball. And I think this is how most people experience envy in their lives. And this is why I agree that intramarital envy is so toxic, right? Because obviously there will be conflicts in a family or within a couple. I mean, you can't always be aligned on everything. But if one conflict kind of bursts the envy balloon, right? And this is how you see a lot of marital conflicts play out. I stay at home with the kids while you go out, or you spend all the money on Peloton while I'm trying to trade stocks, whatever your marriage is like, right? And to me, this idea of having, and this is why things hidden, right? It's like in the Girard, like that there are these things lurking, and you can have a healthy life. You can do all the work on yourself. This is why we are all Freudians. We are, obsessed with what is hidden. But I don't think that you can be, I don't know what level of self-honesty or, spiritual insight you have to have about yourself to really have dealt with everything in advance. Maybe that's enlightenment. And so there always remains these little alligators in our swamps, right? Waiting for your weak moments. And I kind of become a behaviorist when I think about this. I can't hope to go and do like a safari killing in my subconscious and getting rid of everything, right? Also because I need that for motivation, for being funny, for getting out of bed in the morning. Like you need those alligators. They are doing a lot of work for you. But I'm thinking, how can I deal with them in an okay way? How do I know immediately what happened when I feel it? Because I can't always control what I feel, but I can control what I do with that. And so I keep thinking about. I have not been in the situation yet, or I hope maybe never, where I have to deal with my neighbor flourishing and my not flourishing that much. I probably would do everything in my power to find my own path and get out of the comparison. But there are areas in modern life where you can't. That is very uniform, corporate world, suburban world, right? But I think we can teach people how to deal with these things and how to find, like I will never be a Royal Ballet soloist, thankfully, right? And I should not envy the person who has been doing that since she was 2, right?
Thank you for sharing, Anna. And the behaviorist thing, I believe in free will, and I think so freedom is something we haven't talked about a lot today, but I think it's an important part of this whole discussion. Are we just sort of determined to respond mimetically, or can we choose a response? Can we choose our response to certain people and certain things and certain actions? I think freedom is not absolute, it's relative. We can gain freedom or we can lose freedom. There are different levels of freedom. There's physical freedom, there's psychological freedom or unfreedom, there's spiritual freedom. And a person who has made a series of bad decisions throughout their life can become unfree psychologically, spiritually, or maybe even physically if they're in jail. And I think just going back to Rick's point, sort of to give in. Maybe that's not the best phrase, but is it possible to respond anti-memetically in a way, right? And to respond in some surprising way that breaks a cycle. And I mean, one of the most beautiful examples from literature for me is, when Jean Valjean in Les Mis, is staying in the bishop's house and he steals his silver plateware. And the bishop says, he's expecting justice. And he says, you forgot the candlesticks. That this is an example of this, right? You forgot to take the candlesticks. This is an anti-memetic response. And it actually leads to a profound change in his life, right? So that's the power of even a single incident. So I just wanted to throw that in there because I was reminded of it.
So beautiful.
Peter, you also had your hand up.
All right. Look, I don't know, did you get a chance to look at I put 4 questions in the chat. I was wondering, do you want to just pick your favorite or should I just pick one quickly?
Let me see.
Pick your favorites.
You go ahead and pick your favorite, yeah.
Go ahead, pick your favorites.
All right, okay. Well, the thing that's been bothering me for a decade is what to do about the psychology of the moral philosopher. And so I just wondered if there's anything you could say about the implications of mimetic desire theory for moral philosophy and in particular for meta ethics. So what does it tell us about the sort of philosophical methods we might use in order to understand our values and then try and improve on them, and indeed to build up our moral theories? So that's question 1 in the chat. Just an easy one to wrap up.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I hope this opens up a nice discussion. In terms of moral theories, I mean, there's a question about what are the foundations of morality? What are the sources of morality? There's a great book that's titled The Sources of Morality, and I can't remember who wrote it. Is morality, are these social constructs, varies from culture to culture, just a product of some kind of mimetic, agreement or mores, cultural norms or so forth? Or is there, are there things that are objectively good and evil, morally wrong, or morally good? I've been heavily influenced by, by Max Shaler and the phenomenologist Dietrich von Hildebrandt, another person that I've been influenced a lot by. Unfortunately, Girard himself doesn't have a whole lot to say about ethics and morality. So he needs to be brought into dialogue with others, a lot of other people. And I think that I tend to take sort of a phenomenological approach to the world of values. And I think that, you know, values and disvalues can be you know, perceived, and the way that we respond to those values is kind of the foundation of ethics and morality. So this is a value response sort of understanding of it. And we don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to say this one thing. And I think that responding to values, good or bad, so responding adequately to a positive value or to a negative value, you know, for instance, showing disgust or revulsion at something that's evil would be an example of the second case. That is a form of, or an understanding of ethics that mimesis very much sort of kind of complicates, because it assumes, so the question is like, is there a world of objective values or is there not, right? And to what extent does mimesis affect our ability to respond to values, good and bad? To what extent are we responding to the objective thing, and to what extent is our response or our action mimetically influenced? And in this sense, there is sort of there's an anti-memetic, I'll just use that phrase for lack of a better one for now. There's an anti-memetic dimension to ethics if you believe that there are certain things that are objective, they're objective values. And that I don't think has been worked out. I mean, I draw on Aquinas for that pretty heavily. I have a meeting with a Dominican tomorrow morning, and we're going to have this exact conversation. He wrote a book called The Logic of Desire, where he sort of talks about sort of the teleology of desire. And part of the purpose of that conversation is to be able to sort of address this question that you're asking.
Oh, cool. Well, maybe you can let me know how it goes.
I plan to write about it. So I'll post it all over the place once I've actually formed some better thoughts about it.
Wonderful. I'll be waiting. Thanks.
So I had a question that I haven't thought deeply about, but that's been in the back of my mind for a while, is how should mimetic theory live in conjunction with empirical fields that like econ, which we use to, well, make decisions often at the macro level? Can it be fully incorporated? Is it possible to, or should it just live as a reminder on the side? And I'm also curious if there's work being done in this arena that excites you.
I think that it can be integrated, and I hope that it is integrated. I've been trying to, you know, I'm hoping like a Tyler Cowen. He's right down the road from me at George Mason. Like I want to see, because he knows Girard. I think there's behavioral economics is one particular area where I think there's a lot of work to be done where it can be integrated and it can't be treated totally separately. I think we're going to need to understand the role of mimesis in the economy and in politics. So I'm hoping for interdisciplinary efforts. You know, Girard made a statement. He was like, we'll never really be able to understand mimesis unless a bunch of people from a bunch of different disciplines come together in an interdisciplinary effort and teach each other sort of like what they're seeing in their various domains of expertise. So I really hope that happens. In behavioral economics, I think has not done a whole lot with it yet, but I think it's it's the low-hanging fruit. So you know, I'm hoping that somebody like Tyler really takes up the mantle there. I think that the problem is a lot of in most economic theory, mimesis is just like baked in, right? It's just sort of like it's a descriptive science, right? And it's just like, okay, so, you know, people demand this thing at this price, whether it's due to mimetic desire or whether it's due to, you know, demand, supply and demand, like it doesn't matter. Like we don't care. We just know that you know that the demand is there at that price. So it, in a way, most sort of economic science doesn't care about it. But I think that they're starting to. And I'm hoping that there are some ways to actually measure the way that mimesis affects markets. And I think that there are ways to do that. And the way that it affects sort of, consumer behavior and everything from marketing to sort of HR decisions, right? But it's never going to be the kind of empirical science that I think we would hope it to be. I mean, we're dealing with human behavior here, so it's a soft science, but I do think there's a lot of progress to be made.
On that, have you looked at Robert Schiller's work with the whole narrative economics that he won the Nobel Prize for and all that? I think there's a lot of parallels there. He doesn't use the phrase mimetic theory, but he's got his narrative cascades, and the theory maps on very, very neatly, which is where he really is looking at those sort of reciprocal forces that drive prices and markets and bubbles and booms and busts and all the rest of it. So I think that does fit in. There are bridges being built. I'd probably say less so in the world of behavioral economics, but I'm slightly cynical about that whole field.
Yeah, so are most of my colleagues. So that book, Narrative Economics, is on its way to my house as we speak.
I think you'll enjoy it. It will sort of connect a few of those dots, but he doesn't come at it from a Girardian point of view at all. But a lot of what he says, I think, has a lot of scope to be mapped onto the ideas that you explore. Did you have any other questions, Peter? You want to say something?
I was just going to respond to Anna's question. I'll just put it in the chat. It's the logic of desire.
I was just saying, I know Peter put a whole lot in and that he wanted to get to.
Let me scroll back up. So let's see.
I mean, pick one if you feel like it, but I'm happy to just send you annoying emails at some point.
Yeah, I think just go ahead, Peter. Choose the ones that are most important to you.
Well, how about number 2 then? I'm not sure, I might have just missed it, but in the sources list, you mentioned Alistair McIntyre's book, After Virtue, but I couldn't actually find, in the body of your book, any reference to it. So I wondered if there was just something you cut and didn't cut the source or something. And in any case, whether or not I might just be missing something, what connection do you see between sort of McIntyre and Girard and the story you're telling in that book?
What I mean, I know that I read it. I don't know if I could give you the direct link. I just went in doubt. If I read it during the process of writing the book, I just included it in the sources.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's why I included it there. I think that would be an incredibly long, sort of complex discussion. I think it's related. I think it's related to the first question, right? Like sources of morality and ethics and the connection to mimesis. I find that, and I agree with Alistair McIntyre on a lot of his, on most of what he has to say. Actually, I think that your third question though is related to this one. Part of, I think, the challenge of having conversations about mimesis and ethics is, the presuppositions that people just sort of bring to the discussion in the first place. And there, I think McIntyre has some interesting. I think my headphones just cut out. I can't hear myself.
I can still hear you.
Yeah, that's all right. The presuppositions that people sort of bring to these discussions in the first place is critical. Sort of understandings about teleology, about the sources of morality, and in a very pluralistic society, we're all coming to this discussion with different presuppositions. I think McIntyre's thought deeply about that, and I think that's why it's really important. And the third question, I think that so there's a lot of theology in Girard, and we sort of spoke earlier in the salon that I don't think you have to accept it all to have an appreciation for mimetic desire and the phenomenon. For somebody like Thiel or me or a lot of Girardians that I know, I think the theological dimensions of it, especially if you're Christian, maybe make a lot of things click. Everything from original sin, right? Like understanding that as sort of deviated desire. It's sort of like there's additional context that I think where and I think that's why that probably I venture to guess the majority of the Girardians that I know are Christian. But I think in order to really have robust discussions, we sort of almost have to like agree on like what are the presuppositions that we're all bringing to this table here and where to start. And it's one of the reasons why I think the phenomenology of desire and mimesis itself is a good place to start. So because whether or not you believe that has led to the scapegoat mechanism throughout history, and that the crucifixion of Christ was the ultimate sort of like greatest revelation of that mechanism, you don't have to in order to recognize the way that it plays out in some aspects of our society today. So I know that doesn't answer the question really, but I think that when I see McIntyre and I see the question about Christianity, it makes me come right back to the question of what's the best way to approach mimetic theory and to make it sort of understandable without getting in the weeds on discussions that maybe we don't need to be having up front, if that makes sense.
So if Tom Holland was here, he would be like, at some level, we're all Christians, right? We're all kind of working in this echo chamber of sort of inherited. Well, sorry, when I say we're all, people in the West, who've grown up in Western culture, sort of in some sense, all of these Christian like ideas and values are just like in the water and still echoing around and shaping our sort of moral intuitions at the deepest level. And so that's why I sort of had this bracket parenthesis about sort of consciously Christian. As a sort of suggestive remark, but anyway, I don't know what to do with this thought. So,
I agree. I mean, I basically agree with Holland on that, right? So whether you're consciously Christian or anonymously Christian, it doesn't matter. We've all sort of been imbued with these. That's a phrase from Karl Rahner. We've all been imbued with these certain ideas, right? At the same time, I had a great conversation with Jonathan Bai in Austin, who's who basically brought Girard in conversation with Buddhism. And that was a fascinating discussion. Jonathan was raised in the US, but that is something that hasn't been explored at all. So I think one of the things that I'm most excited about is going to places like Japan, where the book is being translated right now, and just finding out like how differently are these questions approached in a culture like that maybe has not been quite as permeated with Christianity as the West has been.
Yeah, totally. It's so funny how sort of sometimes people who sort of see themselves as secular thinkers just basically just quote the Bible without realizing it. This happened to me in a conversation with like one of the founders of the effective altruism movement the other day, where it was just like, how do you start your theory? And he just like started with Jesus. But anyway, that's another story.
So we are out of time. Luke, what's the best way to follow you and keep up with your work?
I think I'm at Luke Burgis on all the major platforms, and feel free to drop me a line via email. It's super easy. It's just luke@lukeburgis.com if anybody wants to reach out. And I'd love to continue the conversation. So I know that there were some questions there just wasn't time to really do justice to them. One I promised to write about, and I will fulfill that commitment once I've had a chance to wrap my mind around it a little bit better. So look out for that. And in the meantime, I'd love to stay in touch. And this has been awesome. Thank you so much for inviting me and for doing these. I hope this was interesting.
Thank you. And I hope everyone got something out of this. Those of you who are a bit more quiet than the rest, connect on the interwebs. There's many places to get in touch these days and keep the conversation going.